Welcome to From Shadows to the Block, a collection where the characters don't just exist, they breathe, they fight, and they survive. If they're lucky.
The Will of Fannie Mae, a short story by Brian Eldridge Sr., 2026. Fannie Mae Philpott was just 13 years old when the normalcy in her life shattered. Within a matter of a day, she met a time-traveling boy who turned out to be her great-grandson from the future, and her older brother was lynched by an angry mob. It all sounded unbelievable, and even Fannie Mae, who lived it, wasn't able to reconcile it. She didn't believe it herself until she woke up on the same day 3 straight days. By the end of the second day, she realized that she was stuck. "Buck, what are you doing here?" she asked Louis's best friend. "Didn't I just see you yesterday?" Buck, a burly man, wearing grimy, torn overalls, walked up the sidewalk carrying a rolled-up paper sack. Fannie Mae could smell the soot on him. The oily smell spread all over the yard like fog. She stood and walked towards him with a smile. Buck took off his cap and held it to his heart and extended the bag. "No, ma'am. I told Louis I would watch out for you," Buck said, giving her the dirty sack. Fannie Mae gave him a smile and peeled the bag open to reveal 8 $1 bills and a loaf of bread. She released a deep breath and looked into his deep-set eyes. Buck wore his devastation like a cloak. However, his sense of duty was ever present. "It's not much, but I don't want you to go hungry," he said. It was the same thing he brought her the day before. That's when she realized that something was off. The following day, it all happened again. She was grateful for Buck and all of Louis's friends who checked in on her. They were all standing in for her big brother, where he couldn't. But the hurt in Buck's eyes was too much to bear. Over and over, Fannie Mae grew increasingly frustrated with what was happening to her, and briefly considered that she might be completely mad. But things began to settle, slowly. It took years for her to learn how to control this curious ability. By the time she turned 20, in 1942, she could fold time and embed temporal energy into inanimate objects. Her ability wasn't something she could explain, and before she knew how to control it, she considered it a curse that the young boy, Jalen, had brought down on her. Despite her frustration with her ability, she was curious about Jalen and where he came from. She clenched her fists, closed her eyes gently, and let her mind imagine a person, a place, and a time. A fleeting nausea preempted a weighted calm when she arrived at her destination. When her eyes opened, she was kneeling in her backyard. She was alone except for the sound of birds singing. She opened the chain-link fence surrounding the yard and began to walk to the driveway when an old truck pulled up. She quickly backtracked and hid around the corner. The truck ground to a halt and 2 doors slammed closed. She heard voices, both familiar. She dared to look around the corner again, and she saw Jalen pulling a green bucket from the truck bed, and Morris, in his 70s for sure, now gathering fishing poles. He looked just like his father, Conrad. She pressed her hand to her heart, feeling a swell of love. "Thanks for taking me fishing, Paw," Jalen said. Morris dropped the poles and hugged Jalen's neck before running his fist through Jalen's curly hair. "Anytime," he said with a chuckle. Fannie Mae felt her breath catch. She knew then exactly why she connected to Jalen. He was her great-grandson. It all made sense. Jalen got his ability from her somehow. She pressed her eyelids together, imagining adventures they could have together, but also holding back tears. Then she realized that she and Jalen probably shouldn't travel together. "There are some things that we probably don't need to know," she thought. With just a little concentration, she was at home, sitting on her porch. As time passed, she took time to understand the duty behind her power. It was trial and error. She wanted to make life better for everyone and change the world. But learning on the fly was a cruel teacher of her duties. Fannie Mae was the only person in the world who heard John Daly on CBS radio discuss the bombing of Pearl Harbor twice as the broadcast aired. That was one of the times she got stuck in a repeating loop. Somehow her wish that it never happened made her live it more than once. She tried to go and warn them, but nobody was listening to a poor black farm girl on a military base. They threw her in the brig before anybody would listen. She stayed as long as she could in hopes that the right person would question her. When the rumbling outside started, she willed herself home, tears in her eyes and fury in her spine. It was one of the lessons she learned organically. Her will wasn't the final authority. The other lesson was that she could only learn from the past. She couldn't change it. Once she knew what she was doing, she went back to 1935 to find her brother Louis. She found Louis walking the dirt path towards the general store. Her heart skipped a beat when she got close, seeing his majestic features and his bright smile shining. He looked at her strangely, with a hint of recognition. "Lou," she said, panting to catch her breath. "It's me, Fannie." She put her hands on her hips and looked around at the tall grass on either side of the path. He squinted and gave a curious smile. "Stop playing. Who are you?" She took one more deep breath for composure and put a hand on his shoulder. He looked at her like she was insane as she spoke. "I'm here to warn you. They're going to try to kill you. You need to run away," she said. Louis looked into her eyes, and then he looked up the path towards the store. "This got something to do with that boy, Jalen?" Fannie Mae frowned. "Listen to me," she said, her eyes burning and tears forming. "They are going to kill you. I seen it. It's happening today." Louis reached into his satchel and gripped his knife on the inside. He wasn't sure who she was, but she did favor his sister. She spoke to him with familiarity. He couldn't explain why he trusted her, but he did. "Who's gonna kill me?" "White men. They coming to get you. It's just off this path," she said. "You gotta run." Louis's jaw tightened and he stood up straighter. His eyes darted all around to search for his assailants. "I can't leave without Fannie Mae," he said, adjusting his cap. Fannie Mae felt a jolt down her spine, and goosebumps formed all over her body. A deluge of tears overwhelmed her, and she wrapped her arms around her brother, crying into his chest. "Just go." Louis hugged her back and kissed the top of her head. "Okay," he whispered. He pushed her away and looked around and gave her another long look. She'll be okay. Just run," she said, her body convulsing. She watched Louis running quickly down the path, the dust trail staircasing into the sky. Fannie Mae sat on the edge of the trail quietly, trying to gather herself. She was numb, having spoken to her brother for the first time in years and having to send him away. It was too much. But despite everything, she felt like she had saved him, and she could go back to the present and find him. She stood up and dusted off her dress and was about to force her way back home when she heard the fearsome crack of a gunshot. Then another. "No, no, no," she pleaded quietly. She stepped into the grass and crept to the tree line, following the cacophony of angry sounds. A shrill shriek blistered through the air, and she heard an angry cheer. As she got a little closer, she found the clearing where men with a cart and horses were stringing her brother up into a tree. She gasped, covering her mouth to muffle what she knew was going to be a scream from the deepest recesses of her body. Her body spasmed as she tried to avoid detection, but all she could think about was that her brother was dying anyway. It was happening in front of her. Again. It was too much, and she dropped to her knees, her legs crashing into the grass and dirt below. A deep gasp came, and then an otherworldly wail burned through the air around her. Even after she stopped screaming, the bellowing echo waved tenaciously through the surrounding woods. She felt the trails of tears running down her face, and a headache pulsed into her eyes. Voices and footsteps grew closer, and she knew that her brother's killers were now coming for her. She closed her eyes as they were only a few feet away and whispered to herself, "Bye, Louis." Then she was back at home, on the porch. A whip of dirt and dust settled around her, and the faint smell of fire followed. She dropped her head into her hands and tried to catch her breath. When she looked up, she saw a dragonfly hovering at the edge of the porch. When it saw her sudden movement, it whizzed by, heading towards the creek. 2 more failed attempts at saving Louis was enough to let her know that she wasn't going to be able to change what happened to her brother, and she didn't want to experience his death again. She didn't want to experience any heartache anymore. She wanted to cast away all her cares and be young and black in maybe the most progressively black place in the country. Since she had gained pretty significant control over her gift and was able to travel seamlessly from one place in time to another without losing real time. Her favorite spot was the Cotton Club in Harlem. She loved listening to Duke Ellington play "It Don't Mean a Thing." Hearing it live was a thrill she revisited for decades, just for the pleasure. "Duke is doing it tonight," a waiter told her one night as she sat at the back of the club. She smiled and bobbed her head as he doo-wopped. She was dressed as a waitress, as only performers and the help could be non-white. The cigarette smoke hung over the room like floating cotton. She could smell the alcohol, feel the body heat, and the vibrant colors were a visual symphony. Holding a tray of drinks, she was distracted by music and turned quickly to move back to the bar when she crashed into a solid figure in a white suit. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, straightening her skirt before making eye contact with the wall of a man she ran into. He smiled at her kindly, his dark skin and high cheekbones emanating a kind aura. "Nat King Cole," she whispered. He smiled at her, lightly touched her shoulder, and walked away. She wasn't a very good waitress, but she didn't care. She just wanted to see the stars. While Duke Ellington was her favorite, she loved seeing Cab Calloway direct the band as well. Hearing Lena Horne, Billie Holiday, and even Ella Fitzgerald perform live was one of the highlights of her life. Fannie Mae also spent time watching the Harlem Suitcase Theater Group perform, as Langston Hughes was one of her favorite writers. However, she realized that her abilities didn't just need to be used for her own purposes. She needed to find ways to help and influence the Black community in a positive direction. Over time, she determined that she would simply find ways to contribute quietly. She called it planting seeds that would eventually sprout into bigger things. One of her favorite ways to help was to share what she knew with her community. She would tell stories about what it was like in Harlem during the Renaissance. She would play the music and read the poetry to the young people. Her hope was to use her passion for the arts to enrich the lives of her neighborhood. She traveled to Oakland during the late 1960s and early 70s and copied the Black Panthers' free breakfast program and brought it back to her community in Louisville. Swift's neighborhood restaurant prepared and served the food. Funding came from her cousin, Chester Wilkes, who had come into some unexpected financial success. Fannie Mae also studied the businesses of the Greenwood district of Tulsa and worked to influence small business owners to work together to form a strong coalition in the community. She never felt like she could do enough, but she did whatever she could. By the 1950s, she was married and had a son. Fannie Mae Philpott was now Fannie Mae Carter, after marrying Conrad Carter of Chicago, Illinois. She gave birth to her son, Morris Carter, in 1953. Still, Fannie Mae never stopped traveling. Her ability would allow her to be in Louisville at 9:49 a.m., travel to Atlanta a decade before at 2:34 p.m., spend days, and then return back to Louisville at 9:49 a.m. She loved what she did, but she didn't want to miss a minute with Morris. And often she'd try to see what Morris was like in his future. It was her way of measuring whether she was a good mother. In 1957, when Morris was just 4 years old, Fannie Mae decided to see what he'd be like at age 25. "I bet you'll be a doctor," she whispered to him, "or maybe a lawyer or a businessman." Morris grinned at her, his 2 front teeth missing. She pecked him on the forehead and closed her eyes. When she opened them, it was 1978. She was standing in her own home, but everything was different. It was all up to date. The books looked newer. There was a reel-to-reel music player on the table in the corner. Pictures of her and Conrad lined the walls. The smell of bacon was in the air. The clock on the table said 7:14 a.m. "Am I making breakfast?" she whispered to herself. She felt pressure in her head as she crept closer to the door. She knew that meant the present version of herself was close. Fannie Mae cracked the bedroom door and peeked into the kitchen. She saw herself sweating over the stove, a red bandana wrapped around her head, and a blue apron on. Both Fannie Maes stumbled briefly, and the older Fannie Mae turned and looked back, making eye contact with the 1957 version of herself. She took the sizzling bacon out of the skillet and placed it on a dish on the counter beside the stove. She wiped her hands and took a couple steps forward before stopping at the counter about 8 feet from the door. The pressure in both their heads was throbbing. "You need to go." 1978. Fannie Mae said, "I'm going to go to the bathroom, and you need to run out the back door." Fannie nodded and waited a second for her to disappear down the hall. When she heard the bathroom door click, she sprinted across the kitchen and out the back door. When she got outside, it was chilly. She looked around the backyard and noticed that there were clothes drying on the clothesline already. She grabbed one of the long-sleeve T-shirts from the clothesline and put it on over her dress. Fannie Mae walked the neighborhood, wondering where Morris could be. Maybe he moved away, she thought as she circled the block. Maybe Louisville wasn't in his future. She walked to Swift's neighborhood restaurant and opened the door. She could smell the soul food aroma filling the air from the back. There was definitely fried chicken and probably some cornbread in the kitchen. She smiled as she saw pictures of Kincaid and Gretchen Swift on the wall, photos so pale that they were almost painful to view. She remembered the way they sounded, the way they smiled, and the way they made everyone feel welcomed. "Grab a seat anywhere," a familiar voice yelled out from behind the counter. Fannie Mae slowly found a seat near the window so she could look outside and take in what the city looked like as Louisville rapidly approached the 1980s. "What can I get you?" the woman asked, not looking up from her pad. Fannie Mae lifted her eyes, and the woman glanced up for a second before locking in. The two women immediately recognized each other. Fannie Mae put her hand on her heart and smiled from ear to ear. "Hazel," she whispered. Hazel's face lit up, and she put the pad down on the table. She sat across from Fannie Mae and grabbed her hands. "Fannie," she stage whispered. Hazel squinted and looked at her, mild confusion on her face. She turned Fannie Mae's hands over from front to back and leaned in. "Are you visiting again?" Fannie Mae smiled wide. She had worked with Hazel's mother during her present timeline, helping implement the breakfast program. When Fannie Mae was in her mid-20s, she spent a lot of time with Hazel, who was in her early 20s. They became fast friends, and Fannie Mae shared her secret. "You might see me when I'm 25 today, and see me next week and I'm 35, she explained slowly. Hazel thought it was crazy, but somehow she felt the truth in Fannie Mae's words. Her family's restaurant had its own aura, so it made sense that there was something special about other people too. "Okay," Hazel said, both women giggling at the thought of these uncanny abilities. Fannie Mae always knew Swifts would be here, so this was one of her main stops whenever she came to the future of Louisville. Yeah, just a quick pleasure trip, satisfying my curiosity, trying to find Morris. Hazel clapped her hands and leaned back in her seat with a laugh. Girl, Morris went out of town with that girlfriend of his, she said. He ain't here. He stopped through last night to get some coffee before they got on the road. The bell rang again as the door opened. Fannie Mae and Hazel both smiled as a young man walked in. He was wearing a plaid shirt and khaki pants. He wore a slouchy hat over his medium afro. His big, bright smile lit up the entire room. Hey, Ms. Hazel, he said with a smile. Antonio, Hazel said, getting up and greeting the young man with a hug. What can I do for you? Fannie Mae looked around, trying not to eavesdrop on their conversation, but she could hear most of it anyway. I just wanted to see if y'all needed help around here. I'm looking for a job. Got laid off at the meatpacking plant. Hazel let him know that they didn't have anything open right now, but she would keep her eyes open, and if she had big deliveries, she would call his house. When he left, Hazel sat back down with Fannie Mae. Who is that kid? Hazel's eyes followed Antonio down the sidewalk. He moved here from North Carolina, Raleigh, I think. He's a nice kid. Just looking for work. Hazel pat Fannie Mae's hands and grinned. So how long are you staying? Fannie Mae blinked a couple of times and pulled her hands away, crossing them across her chest. I guess I'm going back now. She laughed. No reason I need to stay since Morris ain't here. Hazel's face went straight, and a little of the light left her eyes. How much do you know? Fannie Mae shook her head and held out her hands. Don't tell me anything, she said. I'm only here to find out what I want to know specifically. I don't want to know too much because things can go bad in a hurry. Hazel pressed her lips tight and looked around. She opened her mouth to speak when she heard a scream come from outside. Both women stood up, their chairs scraping loudly against the floor. Hazel walked to the window and saw Antonio stumbling back down the sidewalk. He was clearly trying to get away from something. Fannie Mae dashed out the door and dropped to her knees beside Antonio. He was bleeding profusely from his side. He was reaching and gasping. It appeared he had been stabbed in his side, maybe piercing his lung. Call an ambulance, Fannie Mae screamed out. Please, Antonio said quietly, a gurgle escaping his mouth. Help! Fannie Mae pulled off the shirt and pressed it firmly against his gushing wound. A small crowd had assembled around Antonio as she tried to keep him from bleeding to death. She asked a man standing close by to hold the shirt in place, while she tried to keep his heart beating. In her travels, she learned how to do CPR, and she began to perform it on him. She pressed his chest and breathed into his mouth, forcing air into his lungs. For nearly 10 minutes, she tried before the ambulance arrived. When she stood back, she was completely drenched in his blood. She put her fist into her mouth and bit down hard, tears flooding her face. Hazel wrapped her arm around Fannie Mae's shoulders and tried to comfort her friend. The medics pronounced Antonio deceased at the scene. Fannie Mae leaned against the front of the restaurant, crouched down, eyes closed. She hadn't seen anybody die since Louis. His death flashed through her mind. The vision of him being pulled up into the tree. The crack of the gunshots. The neighing sounds of the horses all poured back onto her at once. She could feel the vibrating yell escaping her 13-year-old self and her 20-year-old self. A cold hand on her shoulder snapped her back to the present. "What's your name?" asked a white police officer, his face callous and angry. "What did you do to him?" She stood up and looked him in the eye. Fannie Mae was tall and sturdy. He was no bigger than she was, and she wasn't about to let this white man intimidate her. She was never going to give her real name, since Fannie Mae Carter lived just a few blocks from here. Lula Ann Philpott, she said, giving her mother's name. The cop stepped closer until she could smell the cigarettes on his breath. She could see the stubble on his chin and the dandruff in his dirty blonde hair. These folks said you were pressing on him. Probably made him die faster since you were squeezing the blood out of him. Fannie Mae frowned and her face darkened. One eye squinted and she cocked her head to the side. It's CPR. I know how to do it. I was trying to save his life, she replied with a snarl. The officer grabbed Fannie Mae by the elbow and began to drag her to his car. You're coming with us, he groaned as he tried to force her to his vehicle. No, she snapped, pulling away from him. She stumbled backwards and fell on her butt. Before she could get up, the officer had drawn his weapon on her. Get in the vehicle, or I'll shoot you, he demanded. Fannie Mae saw a bead of sweat rolling down his face. His hat had fallen off in the struggle, and his bald head was exposed to the early afternoon sun. I'm not going to tell you again, he commanded. Hazel stepped outside with her hands up. This is all a misunderstanding, officer, she said. This is my friend. She was just trying to help. The cop shook his head and held the weapon on Fannie Mae. His eyes burned with anger, and his fingers flinched around the trigger. I'll go, Fannie Mae said, getting to her feet and dusting herself off. Hazel stood there, her hand over her mouth, fighting back tears as she watched Fannie Mae voluntarily get into the car. The cop slammed the door closed and hustled around the other side to get in. Fannie Mae turned and looked back at Hazel, who stood glued to the same block of concrete in front of her store. This was their goodbye for now. You should have just got in the goddamn car, the cop groaned, looking through the rearview mirror. Fannie Mae didn't speak. She just gave him the evil eye in the mirror. That's what's wrong with you nigger bitches, all sass. You need a fist in your... He stopped talking when he looked into the mirror, and Fannie Mae was gone. He stopped his car in the middle of the street and jumped out. Both car doors were closed, and he couldn't see her running away in any direction. He leaned against his car and banged his fist against the roof angrily. Fannie Mae was already in her present time. Baby Morris rolled a toy truck across the floor beside the bookshelf. He groaned and laughed as the wheels spun. The child didn't even notice his mother's instant change in demeanor. It wasn't until she began pacing that he looked her way. Mommy, he babbled. Fannie Mae stopped pacing and looked down at his chubby, smiling face. She kneeled down and kissed his cheek before wiping it with her thumb. When she stood again, her mind raced back to Antonio, dying on the pavement in front of Swift's. In her memory, Antonio and Louis shared a face. When her heart began to pound, she clenched her fists, digging her nails into her palms. Her tight curls bounced loose from her head as she began pacing again. I gotta do something, she muttered. Before her words finished coming out, she blinked and found herself sitting in Swift's, Hazel across from her at the table. But there was something different this time. The 1978 Fannie Mae walked by the window and their eyes locked. Fannie Mae put her index finger to the temple of her head and pressed. The Fannie Mae outside shook her head in disapproval and kept walking. The further away she got, the less the pressure in her head bothered her. Girl, Morris went out of town with that girlfriend of his, Hazel said. He ain't here. He stopped through last night to get some coffee before they got on the road. The bell rang as the door opened. Fannie Mae and Hazel both looked up as Antonio walked in. Fannie Mae stood and rushed over to Antonio, placing her hand on his chest. Antonio, right? He put his hand on top of hers and she shuddered. His hand was warm and alive. When she saw him last, only moments ago for her, his skin was ashen and gray. His warmth spilled all over the pavement. Hazel jumped to her feet and put her hands on her hips. How you know, Tonio? Fannie Mae gave Hazel a quick smile and turned her attention back to Antonio. Come sit with me, she said, pulling him to her table. Antonio gave a nervous smile, watching Hazel as Fannie Mae dragged him to the seat Hazel previously occupied. You looking for work? She asked, leaning in. His brow furrowed and he clasped his fingers. Yeah, I am, he replied. Hazel frowned. I'll get y'all some coffee, she said, walking back to the kitchen. Fannie Mae pat her hands on the table and released a deep breath. She looked up at his face. His caramel-colored skin was glowing, and his eyes were almond-shaped and bright. He was a nice-looking man. Who would hurt this man? She thought. Nervous, Antonio began to scoot back so he could leave. I need to go, he said, before she grabbed his wrist. I'll give you $20 if you stay, she said. He looked at her face a while, noticing the desperation in her eyes. He liked looking at her. She was pretty. Soft features, deep brown eyes, and a nose that came to a rounded peak. But he wasn't sure why she wanted him to stay, and that concerned him. Are you a working girl? He whispered. Fannie Mae cocked her head back and laughed out loud. At first it was humorous, but it turned nervous and dragged a little long. Don't you guys usually pay them? Antonio grinned for a second, and then released his own loud laugh. Hazel left their coffee and went to see other customers who were just coming in. So what brings you to Louisville? Fannie Mae asked. He shifted in his seat and looked out the window before grabbing his cup and taking a sip of his coffee. Had some stuff go down back in North Carolina. It was time to go. Nothing there for me but trouble, he said. Fannie Mae nodded, her hands wrapped around her untouched coffee. So you left the trouble behind? He sighed and then a sharp chuckle. That was the plan. But trouble seems to find me like an old bloodhound, Antonio said. I just try not to be a bad person, even if I do bad things sometimes. Their eyes met for a moment, and then Fannie Mae finally took a sip of her drink. You got a family? She asked, her cup rattling softly on the table. Nah, it's just me. But I got my eye on a lady. She lives a few blocks away. Been trying to get her to let me take her to the picture. Fannie Mae smiled warmly. She pressed her hand to her chest. That's lovely, she said softly. If she's the one for you, don't give up. Tell her why she's important to you. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his hand across his khaki pants. A quick squinted eye came before his words. Why do you care so much? Fannie Mae's smile didn't leave her face. I've seen what could happen. I just don't want to see you or anybody go the wrong way, she said, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a rolled-up $20 bill. She slid it across the table. He reached for it, and their hands touched briefly. You know, in a different time, maybe I'd ask you to the picture show. Fannie let out another deep laugh and put her hand over her chest as the laugh subsided. Maybe I would have said yes. Antonio scooted his chair back and stood. He removed his hat and pressed it to his chest and began to walk towards the exit. Then he stopped and faced her. If I ever did ask you out, I realize I don't even know your name. Her smile began to fade slightly as she spoke. Lula Ann, she said softly. Antonio's smile widened. Ms. Lula Ann, he said, walking back to the table and extending his hand. They shook hands, his large fingers warming hers. Nice to make your acquaintance. I'm Antonio Dwayne Clemens. He slowly let go of her hand, and they stared for another beat. He dropped down in front of her as the light in her smile returned. If I see you again, I'm going to save this piece of money and take you to the show, he said. Fannie Mae felt a wave of heat over her body and goosebumps up her arms. She blinked several times and found her hand lightly patting her curls. Would you say yes? Her mouth opened, but the words held firm on her tongue. She started to speak, but he stopped her. I'm not young as I look. I'm almost 30, he argued, reaching for her free hand. She felt a buzz when he touched her, a feeling she had never felt before, not even with Conrad. She placed her hand on top of his, feeling how unexpectedly soft his hands were. His smile was crooked, but sincere. She watched his long, dark eyelashes bat in slow motion. Go find your girl, sweetie, she said, resigning herself to reality back in 1957. He released her hand, but not the smile she put on his face. He showed her the $20 bill, folded it, and placed it in his shirt pocket with a wink. He strutted confidently out the door. Fannie Mae sighed and patted both hands on the table. She stood and caught Hazel's attention. Hazel stood behind the counter, her arms crossed. She gave a glare to Fannie Mae that made her uncomfortable. She hurried out the door and walked the opposite direction of Antonio. She ducked around the corner into an alley, and 2 steps later, she was ending her pacing in her living room. Little Morris reached out to give her his truck. She took it with a smile and spun the wheels as he giggled. She fell back on her couch and released a long-held sigh. Her skin was flush, and she could still feel a tingle down to her bones. The soft heat of Antonio's touch was still imprinted on her hand. That night, as she slept beside Conrad, she rolled over to face him. He was fast asleep. She gave him a soft kiss on his cheek, but he continued his deep slumber. She shook his shoulder, but he only groaned and rolled the other way. She blew a deep sigh and rolled out of the bed. Ambling down the hallway and to her family room, she sat on the couch and crossed her legs before leaning her head back, placing her palms over her eyes. Antonio, she thought. Remembering the energy of his touch sent a warm wave over her body, and the stout build of his chest, when they touched, flashed through her mind. She remembered dragging him to the table and their easy conversation. His crooked smile burrowed into her conscience, triggering a big smile of her own. This is crazy, she thought. Before she finished the thought, she was on her feet, padding to the closet and pulling out a dress and a pair of shoes. I'm just going to check on him, she whispered. Give him a couple of years to get on his feet. When she was dressed, she softly closed the closet door and closed her eyes tight. A short burst of nausea and the feeling of a flip found her standing on West Market Street in front of a gas station. The sun shone high in the sky, and she could smell the Ohio River only a few blocks to the north. A barge horn thundered in the background. Standing out front was a man with his back turned, putting gas in a brown Datsun. A car honked as it drove past. He waved, still with his back turned. Fannie Mae couldn't stop staring. She felt drawn to him, like an unseen tether. Just checking on him, she said to herself, watching from 30 yards away. He hung up the pump and began to walk inside to make his payment, but he stopped mid-step, like he heard something, like someone called his name. He looked to both sides before he took another step and stopped again, before turning all the way around and making immediate eye contact with Fannie Mae. They both stood there, frozen. Lula Ann, he mouthed. She placed her hand over her chest as she felt the butterflies in her stomach be replaced by dragonflies buzzing around. She leaned forward, but stopped. This isn't right, she thought. He reached forward, his hand held out before he yelled out. Lula Ann! She wanted to reach forward too, but she stopped herself as she saw him begin to run towards her, quickly approaching. He stopped about 5 feet from her and smiled. It is you, he said, reaching for her. She recoiled briefly, still fighting against her impulse. Lula Ann, he said softly, reaching into his wallet. He pulled out a faded and folded $20 bill. Her face cracked into a smile and spontaneously broke into tears. She wrapped her arms around him, and he lifted her from the ground, spinning her around. She laughed softly when he put her down. "Can I take you out tonight?" he asked. Her mouth opened and she hesitated. She thought of Morris sleeping in his bed, Conrad's kiss on her cheek. She thought of Louis and all the lessons she'd learned about changing things that shouldn't be changed. But Antonio's hand was warm in hers, and the word forced itself from her mind to the atmosphere surrounding them. "Yes." Thank you for walking these streets with me. From shadows to the block is a world woven from these lives and desperate moments. None of them exist alone. Every story here echoes into the next. I'll see you in the shadows.